Hi everyone, and welcome back to another wonderful lesson with me, Miss Horn. So we just finished up the unit on industrialization and the Industrial Revolution and the causes and what led to it, and now we are going to talk about the consequences of industrialization. And one of the major consequences that we cannot ignore that we are going to start right off the bat with is imperialism. We started this discussion at the end of the last unit when we were talking about nationalism and the causes leading up to World War I. So, College Board has acknowledged that the consequences of the Industrial Revolution are so grand that it needed to be its own little unit to be able to explain the growth and the expansion during imperialism and how it actually set up for World War One. So we are going to start off talking about it. One of the books that we are going to talk about, or not extensively, but we are going to talk about specifically in this PowerPoint, in this lecture, is Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. It is a book that I actually read in high school in English 4. I don't know if people still read it, but it is very much relevant to history and especially the age of imperialism because it talks about the duality of imperialism. And we're going to examine that a little bit in the lecture when I see you next. So I start off with this quote because it really does set the tone for the rest of this lecture. So it says, "The dreams of men, the seed of commonwealth, the germs of empires." We're going to talk about why this quote in particular is the one that I chose to start off this lecture with. So let's just dig right into it. So one of the things that I really want you to understand is that the Industrial Revolution encouraged the practices of what's called new imperialism. We're going to look at the effects of African, South, and East Asian societies and how they were impacted by these economic practices made by Europe. So let's just dig right into it. We know that the industrialized powers established transoceanic empires. We have looked at this since the age of imperialism. We have looked at this since land-based empires moved to the transoceanic empires. And it really starts with Europe, Spain, Portugal, then the British, then the French, then the German, and the Dutch. All of them would get involved. We know that they established that these established existing colonies only strengthened the control that the British and the Netherlands and so on had over their existing colonies. For example, the British in India. We also know that the European states, as well as the United States and Japan, established empires throughout Asia and throughout the Pacific. What am I talking about? So we are going to look at that. We are going to look at these examples of how the United States and how Japan expanded and became imperialists right along with the rest of Europe. We're also going to examine how warfare and diplomacy were used to establish empires in Africa, how the Europeans established quote-unquote settler colonies. This would be South Africa, Australia and New Zealand for the British, and Algeria for the French. We're also going to look at the difference between neo-colonialism in Latin America and then economic imperialism in places like China, and how they definitely differ, but also how they are very much in the same. With neocolonialism, you see the British and the United States investing heavily in Latin America without actually having a colony there, but they still have a presence. But they're like, no, we're not imperialists here. But I mean, they kind of are. Whereas with economic imperialism, you saw the British and the French creating the opium wars in China to specifically control the economics of China. So, when we talk about imperialism, what do we mean exactly? We are looking at this concept where one country has complete and total domination over another country, or region. So that means they are controlling the political, economic, and or cultural life of these countries that they go into. And many European countries were already practicing imperialism. We know this because of the age of exploration. Once they started to branch out and find other lands and started to establish colonies, that's when they started to expand their empires and their spheres of influence. So imperialism was really spurred by the economic development that we were seeing in Europe that occurred during the Industrial Revolution. So I've shown this map to you in class, and this map shows the major world states and what they possessed during the 1900s. And you can see that this comes after the independence movements in Latin America. So pretty much all of Latin America is just on their own. Whereas you have Africa, that a large portion of it is still being controlled by France, Great Britain, Spain. And it's very, 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 very unfortunate. We're going to talk about why it's unfortunate and all of the great things that Africa has to offer before the European colonizers got there. So hang with me, right? So the reason why Africa, we talk about it so much is because it really does become such a big deal. One, the colonizers were already depleting resources from Africa in the fact that they were taking men, women, children and sailing them across the ocean to be slaves, right? And then they were like, oh, wait, you have more resources rather than human capital. So let us set up shop here and expand. And with that expansion, they found new resources, rubber being one of them, diamonds being another one. So they wanted to control as much of Europe or much of Africa as possible. So they met in the Berlin Conference to decide who gets what and how they would expand. And they completely and utterly disregarded the fact that tribes had been here way longer than they have. So they put warring tribes together, which created a lot of chaos and a lot of tension that is still seen in some parts of Africa to this very day. Ugh. So we actually talked about these images in class. So I am going to skip way forward so we can talk about those first instances of imperialism. So we see it here. This is proof that imperialism was around before, but the imperialism that we see now that we're talking about now, is very unique. It's the new imperialism. Before, they were setting up colonies, like it was, for escaping religious persecution, and then later on, they began supplying natural resources like sugarcane, fur, cotton, tobacco, and then, a laundry list of other resources. But then it became more than that. Mother countries depended on these resources to keep industrialization going. And once the United States declared its independence, they now lost out on those resources because now they were having to trade for them. So Europe was going to look for them in other places. So what we're really talking about is new imperialism. So what drove it? Well, the Industrial Revolution. Like, with the Industrial Revolutions, you had a new set of needs and a new set of desires. Manufacturers needed access to resources like rubber, petroleum, manganese, which was used in the steel process, and also palm oil, which they needed for lubricant for the machinery. And when they established these colonies, they also opened up new markets. These new markets let new people in, so they had more people to sell these goods to. And then they also had the outlet for growing their populations. There was also political and military motives behind it too. So as empires were growing and expanding, so were the military and the military powers. So the steam-powered merchant ships and the naval vessels needed bases around the world to take on coal and supplies to keep them running, right? They also were there to stop other nations from expanding. And they're supposedly were there to increase national security. Ultimately, what it was doing was showing who had the better military power. And at this point in time, the best navy in all of the land was Great Britain. There's no arguing about that. We already knew that. But there was also this humanitarian and religious goals a part of the new imperialism as well. Because these people that they were, encountering for the first time across the world were different and looked different and acted different and had different beliefs, many Europeans felt a concern for these godless heathens of the world. So they actually saw themselves as spreading the blessings of Western civilization to the world. And now this Western civilization included medicine and law and the Christian religion. No, never mind the fact that all of these places in the world already had a code of law that they were following. Many of the places in the world that they were going to had given the Western world the basis for their medicine and given the Western world for their basis of law, and also given the Western world the basis for the Christian religion. It's ridiculous. It's ridiculous. And they were able to justify it for so long because of what's called social Darwinism. So social Darwinism is basically the sense of racial superiority, thinking that you are so amazing and that God blessed you so much that you need to share it with the rest of the world. So social Darwinism actually took Darwin's idea about natural selection and turned it into survival of the fittest. And the social Darwinism looked at applying that concept to human society. So this Darwinian theory of natural selection and survival of the fittest was taken by colonizers and they applied it to human societies around the world because we, the colonizers, were able to survive. That must mean that we are the fittest and we have an obligation to share it with human society and transform them. Europeans honestly, wholeheartedly thought that they were superior to all others, and they were meant to dominate the weaker races. They actually had all of these theories about how, that Europeans or white people's heads and brains were perfect. You see the image here, right? Where it's comparing Apollo's skull to that of a Creole to that of a young chimpanzee. I am not kidding you. This is how they justified the practices of dominating quote unquote weaker races. No, never mind. We just, talked about this with chattel slavery, but, whatever. They're doing it again. And they're doing it again in a way that is absolutely appalling. So social Darwinism was actually put on display at the human zoos of Paris. This is quite literally where they had a colonial exposition that was located just outside of the city of Paris that ran from, roughly May to October of 1907. And visitors to this zoo could come and observe the natives living in their typical environment. And there were about 6 different villages that represented Madagascar, Indochina, Sudan, Congo, Tanzania, and Morocco on display. And these were all people who were from the French colonial empire. These villages and their pavilions were built to recreate the life and culture as it would have been seen in their original habitat. So these people were taking other people and putting them on display in a zoo like we do animals today. We're going to watch and talk about these videos in class when I see you next, because this is absolutely appalling and atrocious, and I can't believe people got away with this without somebody going, "Are you kidding me?" We're also going to talk more about Kipling's White Man's Burden, and more about why he felt the need to write it. And we're also going to talk way more about the heart of darkness. So I'm going to skip over these next couple of slides. So how did the ideologies contribute to the development of imperialism? Think about that. As we continue on through how the power shifted. So let's talk about state expansion during this time. This really digs at the heart of Africa, and we are going to watch Africa's great civilizations when I see you next. So we're going to hold off talking about Africa until we watch that video. We're going to talk about the United States and Japan for a second, because the United States was not immune. The United States wanted to be so incredibly different from Europe that we turned out to be exactly like Europe. We just went about it a different way. So US imperialism actually starts with manifest destiny. And manifest destiny is this whole idea that it is the duty, it's our destiny as the United States, to expand and unite all of the continental United States. So that's what you see here with the Louisiana Purchase, the annexation of Texas, the Mexican secession, and the purchase of, this little portion of Mexico and the Oregon country. And then Alaska comes on, and then Cuba and Puerto Rico, then you have Panama, and then you have Hawaii and a lot of the other Indonesian islands. So we really start to branch out and become exactly like Europe. And I'm going to tell you that Hawaii and all of these islands here would become a major, major problem for Japan in World War II. We're going to talk about that a lot more. But it really is this whole idea that the United States was destined to become a great power. So we kept imperializing, we kept gaining territory. And the way we gained Hawaii in particular absolutely frustrates me and makes me want to punch somebody in the face. Alaska was purchased by a couple of senators for nothing because they, wanted the access. They wanted to gain more land for the United States. But Hawaii in particular really makes me want to punch somebody, really makes me want to hurt somebody. So we are going to look at Hawaii as a separate case. Remind me to show you the picture of my door last year where I did Hawaii, my class, decorated my door for homecoming to showcase American imperialism, specifically in Hawaii. So the United States was not immune to it, and neither was Japan. For Japan, it really was more about economics than it was about just being a world power, which the United States wanted to compete with, the powers of Europe. And they too wanted resources, but mostly they wanted to compete with the powers of Europe. Whereas Japan became an imperial power because of economic resources. They are such a tiny little island, they have finite amount of resources that they had no choice but to expand. And that is very much what they did, as you can see here. They controlled parts of China, they controlled Korea, parts of Manchuria, and also parts of that Indochina region that you're seeing. They're in purple. Yeah. Cool. Yeah, so this image is kind of like the debutante ball where Japan officially makes her debut to the world as an imperial power. And you can tell this by the way the other women are dressed. You have America and Japan on display with the other world powers. You can see this one is France, this one is clearly Britain. You have Italy and Austria, you've got Germany. Oh yeah, they're all here. They're all here. So this is an example of how quickly Spain fell apart. Once they went through a bit of turmoil, they essentially lost like everything that they had. So we're going to talk about the decline of the Spanish Empire. So let's look at Russia for a second. So particularly how Russia was expanding during this time as well. So Russia, this was Russia before. And then they started acquiring all of this additional territory to become an imperial power. And they really were an imperial power. They control the biggest chunk of land in the world at this point in time. The Alexanders and the Nikolai were able to continue this expansion. But the issue in Russia is that this expansion and the forced industrialization would ultimately lead to the downfall of the imperial family because they got too big and they didn't really govern it very well. Shocker, right? Absolute shocker. So what are the global implications of this when it comes to economics? Well, export economies specialized in, commercial extraction of raw materials. So in the American Midwest, you had the wheat, Caribbean, you had the sugar, West Africa, you had cocoa and palm oil, Egypt had cotton, South Africa had the gold and the diamonds, Argentina had meat, the Amazon basin had rubber, and southern Russia had wheat as well. So you needed these raw materials because they were used to purchase the finished goods. But what you see is a decline of economically productive agricultural based economies. So the British wanted to produce their own cotton and to stop importing it from China, not China, India. Because the import duties were placed on textiles that were imported from India, which meant that it cost way more to buy India or to import India products than it was to make your own. So the Indian textile production went from 33% to 3%. Hand-woven Indian textiles could not compete with the cheaper machine-woven textiles that were being produced in Great Britain during the Industrial Revolution. So the industrialized states went out and sought new customers for these finished goods. So the British and French needed these new markets. They needed new consumers. China was not willing to trade with Europe, so the British and the French found a way to force them to trade. The British did this with illegally importing opium, which resulted in China getting addicted to the opium. So they started to increase supply of the opium, get everybody addicted, then started to pull back on it after the British had, told China of the gold and the silver, and they started to trade like, hey, we'll trade you this, but this opium is worth a lot. And what they ended up doing is flooding the market with opium and then pulling back on the opium. And somebody along the way was like, we have to stop this. So the opium wars broke out. And after losing the opium wars, the Chinese were forced to open some markets to British traders. They lost. They were addicted to opium and they lost a war. And they continued to be addicted to opium and had to be forced to trade. Then you had the development of extensive mining centers that increased the decreased demand. It's not decreased. They increased demand because of the Industrial Revolution. These extensive mining centers were, instrumental. You had copper mines in Mexico, and then you also had the gold and diamond mines in South Africa. This is also where the term blood diamonds comes from, because people were literally killing each other and people were dying in the mines to get these diamonds for the rest of the world. And they worked in some poor working conditions to dig for all of this stuff for Europeans to fight over it. I ain't saying it's right, but it happened. Colonizers really screwed up the world. Like, really screwed them up. We'll talk about that next time. Bye, everyone.